When I was about 38 years old, I felt that God was calling me into the ordained ministry. So I started going through the process of discernment that the church has for you. And as I did that, I began to think about how the Holy Spirit was calling me. And so I started thinking back in my family history, because my great-grandfather was an ordained minister too. He was a missionary to the Lakota people in South Dakota. And so I wondered, well, what was his call? How did the Holy Spirit call him? Every minister ought to have a call story, right? So I looked up his biography. He was a well-known missionary, and his niece had written a biography of him later in his life. And my mother had given me a copy of the biography, so I looked up in the book what it said. And I was quite disappointed. He graduated from Beloit College in Wisconsin in 1868. And then, of course, he was wondering what he was going to do for a career. And he'd been raised as a missionary kid, but he didn't know exactly what he wanted to do. He tried a year of teaching in Mississippi. And then he said, I concluded that work with the Indians was the one great opportunity of my life. I mean, what kind of a call story is that? It's sort of like, well, I guess that's the most practical thing for me to do, so that's what I'll do. Where was the call of the Holy Spirit? But his father was also a missionary, my great-grandfather. And so my great-grandfather had grown up, in the mission field. As a little boy, he played among the Indians, and he'd learned their language just like one of them, and he knew their culture. And so really it was a good fit, natural choice for him. He knew what it was like to be a missionary, and he had the skills and the experience. But there didn't seem to be anything in that story about a calling by the Holy Spirit. So I talked to my Aunt Betty. Aunt Betty is the family historian, and she's the one who's taken it upon herself to make sure that all the family history, especially of the missionary families, was recorded somewhere, compiled in the South Dakota History Society. And when I asked her about Great-Grandpa's call, she said, well, they didn't talk like that back then. They didn't talk about the movement of the Holy Spirit, and they didn't use that kind of language. And your great-grandfather was a private person, so he just didn't talk about that. So I guess that's the best I'll ever know about what his call was. So how does God work? How does the Holy Spirit work in the church? I mean, the New Testament is very clear that on the day of Pentecost, which we're celebrating today is Pentecost Sunday, on that very first Pentecost day, the Holy Spirit came down upon the disciples. It says that they were all gathered together in one place. There may have been as many as 100 of them. They're all together in one place praying, and they heard a sound like the rush of a mighty wind. And tongues of fire appeared above them. One tongue appeared over the head of each disciple. And they were filled with the Holy Spirit, it says, and they began to speak in languages that they themselves didn't know, praising God. And outside the house, outside the building, there were a crowd of people out there who gathered, and these were people from all over the known world. People from Rome and Africa and what is now Turkey and Europe. And of course they come to Jerusalem because they wanted to worship in Jerusalem or study. Some were good Jewish people, some were attracted to the Jewish religion. So all these people from all the parts of the earth were there, and when they heard the disciples praising God in their own languages, they were amazed and astonished. How can this be? These are just ordinary Galilean fishermen and peasants, how do they know my language? And so Peter, good old Peter, got up and he made the first speech of his life. First time he'd ever got up before a crowd. And he says, I'll tell you what's going on here. He says, this is what was prophesied a long time ago by the prophet Joel. He said that in the days to come, God will pour out his Spirit upon you, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your young men shall have visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. And all who call upon the Lord will be saved. That's the story of how the Holy Spirit first came upon the earliest church. And some people say that's the birthday of the church, the day the church was born, when the Holy Spirit began the movement that was to be the church. And of course, in the rest of the Acts of the Apostles, we hear a lot about how people were filled with the Holy Spirit, especially upon baptism. Stephen, the first martyr, it says, was filled with the Holy Spirit, even as he was being stoned to death, and he looked up to heaven. Peter and John, when they went to Samaria, baptized some believers, and they were filled with the Holy Spirit. Same thing when Paul went to Ephesus. He baptized them, people were filled with the Holy Spirit, they spoke in tongues, they began to prophesy. So, the Holy Spirit had a strong activity in the early church. Being filled with the Holy Spirit was a mark of being a believer in those early days. And Paul continually talks about the movement of the Holy Spirit. We heard about how he said that the gifts of the Spirit are in the church. Some are pastors, some are teachers, some are givers. The gifts of the Spirit are poured out upon the members of the church. So in other words, it's the Holy Spirit that runs through the church. It's the Holy Spirit that gives life to the church. Well, what happened? Where's the Holy Spirit? I mean, those early years of the church were filled with the power of the Holy Spirit, but it didn't seem to last very long. I mean, even in the pages of the New Testament, as the letters move along, you can see that the church, as it became more organized and more structured and more hierarchical, it began to lose the influence of the Holy Spirit. Became less dependent on the Holy Spirit. Before long, they were arguing about, who was in and who was out, and who could be a leader and who couldn't, and who could come to communion and who couldn't. I mean, it seems like they lost that inspiration from the Holy Spirit. I remember distinctly one of the lectures from my church history professor in seminary, Dr. Armentrout. And he said something that really struck me. He said that in the history of the church, what happens is that the church becomes kind of sterile and dried up and loses all its energy. And what happens is that the Holy Spirit sends someone to bring a new message to the church, and a new movement is started in the church. Something springs up and brings new life to the church, and people are attracted to it, and new energy arises, and it's incorporated into the church, and it enlivens the church, it renews the church. And as time goes on, it becomes accepted and becomes taken for granted, and then it becomes sort of dried up itself, and it becomes fossilized, and the church is dead again. But then the Holy Spirit sends a new person, a new movement, and again the church is revitalized with new energy and new movement, and the church is renewed. And then that movement itself becomes part of the church, and it becomes taken for granted, and it becomes desiccated and dried up and frozen, and God has to send the Holy Spirit again. But Dr. Armentrout said, the best proof that the Holy Spirit exists is that the church has survived all these centuries. If it wasn't for the Holy Spirit, for sure, the church would have been dead a long time ago. The Holy Spirit is what keeps the church going. Now, sometimes the Holy Spirit works in really loud and dramatic ways. People are filled with the Holy Spirit. They speak in tongues. They prophesy. They're filled with power. And sometimes the Holy Spirit speaks in very quiet ways. We hear the Spirit through meditation and prayer and silence. And I wonder if today that's not the way the Holy Spirit is working. There's a whole movement of contemplative prayer and meditation trying to help us listen to what the Holy Spirit is saying to us. I believe the Holy Spirit is working right here at St. Germain's. It was the Holy Spirit that brought us here this morning, that drew us. It's the Holy Spirit that speaks to us in the reading of the Bible. It's the Holy Spirit that lifts us up in the Eucharist. And most importantly, it's the Holy Spirit that binds us together as a community of caring and love. That's what the Holy Spirit is doing. Here's what one theologian says about the work of the Holy Spirit. He says that the Holy Spirit is not just about speaking in tongues and doing those dramatic things, but what really matters is the rich and deep awareness of God's presence, the sense of the liberating power of his love, the upsurging response of joy and praise, the discovery of a new freshness in the words of the Bible, and the consciousness of communion with the Father through Jesus Christ. So the Holy Spirit continues to enliven and animate the church even now. The Holy Spirit never leaves us.